Welcome back to the Florida History Show. In Season 1, we covered a period of 300 years from 1513 to 1815. And now we are poised to move into a period of time where the United States government takes control of the territory of Florida. This episode is called A New Sheriff in Town, and it covers the period of 1818 to 1845. The journey from territory to statehood was significant, leading us to become the 27th state in the Union. Looking ahead, we have more stories of Florida, and we hope you keep following the Florida History Show and hear those stories too. Here we go. Now, we left off talking about what was going on after the War of 1812 and the Creeks and the Seminoles invading townships in Alabama and Georgia. And so who do you suppose they sent to clean all that up with the Seminoles and the Creeks in southern Alabama and southern Georgia? Who's this guy? Who is this guy? It's not Napoleon. That's the wrong country. This is the hat of Andrew Jackson. In fact, this is the hat that I would wear if I were a general all the way from 1812 to 1840. So, enter Indian fighter General Andrew Jackson and his Tennessee boys. Jackson was commissioned by the United States to descend down on the Creek, Seminoles, and British alike. Both British and American forces moved easily through Spanish Florida, and Spain just watched. Jackson won back Pensacola before closing the War of 1812 with a spectacular victory at the Battle of New Orleans. And then Jackson returned to put down the Seminoles, who were causing trouble for settlers in North Florida in 1818. And that experience was called the First Seminole War. When the Seminole raids on American communities in South Georgia and Alabama became a significant problem, Jackson was ordered into Spanish North Florida to root out those warriors. This was basically just an excuse to invade Florida. But the message was clear to Spain. If you can't control the people who live in your territory, then we will. And we will occupy Pensacola while we're doing it. It was all part of the grand scheme first devised by Thomas Jefferson. You remember it was Jefferson in 1802 who first had the mindset that the United States must control the entire continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that's why the Louisiana Purchase was so important. Well, President James Monroe, who was a protege of Jefferson, declared when the opportunity to win Florida presented itself, he ordered Jackson to take quick and decisive action. He sent him back into Florida. So in 1818, with an overwhelming military presence in North Florida, the United States, with Jackson as the spearhead, demanded that Spain surrender the territory. Spain had no alternative but to get out of Florida under the best terms that it could. So, on February the 2nd, 1819, February 2nd, 1819, President James Monroe signed a treaty deeding Florida to the United States of America. Impressive ceremonies to exchange flags took place in both Pensacola and St. Augustine in 1821. And then Jackson made his third trip to Florida, this time as the military governor of the new U.S. possession. Jackson's headquarters was actually in Pensacola. Tallahassee didn't even exist then, so he never presided from Tallahassee. And during his short 3-month term as the military governor, he and his loyal Tennessee boys began the U.S. territory of Florida and set about the Americanization of La Florida. Who was Florida's first territorial governor? Anybody know? No, it was William P. Duval. Who's that? He was from Jacksonville,
and he was the first territorial governor. Finally, Florida was in its present form. Finally, the United States of America actually owns Florida. And it was a relief to the U.S. and its policy because we just couldn't afford to have Spain holding our country's southern border.
So to help this new U.S. territory, President Monroe, and if you reside in Tallahassee, you may know the name Monroe Street, he appointed a legislative council to help him run the new territory. And it was comprised of 2 delegations. Logically, one from St. Augustine and one from Pensacola. So to have a meeting of the Legislative Council, these 2 groups, separated by nearly 400 miles of wilderness, would have to get together in the same spot. Well, the first session of Florida's Legislative Council was held on July 22nd, 1822, at Pensacola. The St. Augustine delegation, remember, they're 400 miles apart. The St. Augustine delegation traveled 29 days by water to attend that meeting. They came all the way around the peninsula to get to Pensacola from St. Augustine. And then the next session in 1823 would be held in St. Augustine. So this time the Pensacola delegation, or at least part of the delegation, also traveled by water. But they were shipwrecked near the Keys. No one knew where they were. They barely escaped death and obviously arrived late.
Well, not surprisingly, the first decision at the second session, when the Pensacola guys finally straggled in, was to select a halfway location between Pensacola and St. Augustine, and that location would become a new capital city. So why did they go by water for those first 2 meetings? Anybody know? You're right. They went by water and by boat because there were no trails in that 400 mile. No former trails to get their wagons through. And it was dangerous. The Indians were sometimes hostile. So it was dangerous. Water was a safer bet.
The new capital would be located between the Swanee Rivers east of us and the Ochlockonee River, which is just to the west of Tallahassee. Those were the parameters of where they would have their third meeting. Well, St. Joseph was a possibility. Let's see, there was Port St. Joe, just west of Tallahassee, and then also St. Mark's, immediately south of here, about 15 miles. Both those cities were ruled out because of recent yellow fever epidemics. So, Governor Duval sent 2 commissioners to meet in the middle and decide a halfway location between the 2 cities. Dr. John Simmons was from St. Augustine, and he set out from the east, and John Lee Williams set out from Pensacola from the west. They hacked their way towards each other and met at St. Mark's. Actually, John Lee Williams came partially by boat. Then they worked their way due north from St. Mark's to higher ground, Tallahassee. And he sent a message back to Governor Duval, and he said, "We will settle in the red hills of Appalachia. They are high, they are healthy, and they are well watered." Water was a major key. Fresh water would be needed no matter where they met. There actually used to be a waterfall just east of where the Capitol stands today. But it was Williams who actually picked the exact spot for the new Capitol building, which would be no more than a cabin. Now, for the Creek Indians, they didn't like it very much. They and the Seminoles objected, but they did not resist with force. This was the wilderness after all. It was very primitive. There were no structures around of any kind, just a field. So later that year, they made a clearing at the top of the tallest hill they could find, pretty much the first one they got to heading north. A large hill, which is where the Capitol complex sits now. And they built that primitive cabin that we see now to house the very next meeting of the Legislative Council. And then, 2 years later, a more permanent structure was built, which served as the capital until 1845. 1845 was the year that Florida actually became a state. So they became a territory officially in 1821. 20-something years later, they finally become a state. We finally become our own state. Richard Keith Call, who was the third governor of Florida, you may know Call Street if you reside in Tallahassee, and Robert Walton, Florida's first Secretary of State, hence Fort Walton Beach, for those of you in the Panhandle, just west of Destin, just east of Pensacola. Fort Walton Beach was also named for Robert Walton. Well, both those guys, Call and Walton, were both early followers of Jackson who decided to stay here and make Tallahassee their home. Well, since many of Jackson's men were from Tennessee, they charted Tennessee Street, 4 blocks north of the capital, to be the most prominent road. And today, Tennessee Street is actually US 90, which goes all the way from Jacksonville to Pensacola. So how did Tallahassee get its name? Tallahassee is adopted from an Indian Creek name, which means Old Town, as in old, like hundreds of years old when the Appalachians were here. I've also heard that Tallahassee translates into Old Village. That's right. It was the Seminoles and the Creek people who lived in this land previously worked by the Appalachians 200 years ago, who actually named this location in the hills of Appalachia. Well, Florida grew quickly from that point, so by the time we get to 1830, more than 60,000 residents occupy the state. South of Orlando, however, there were no settlements at all until you reached Key West. Now think about that. No settlements at all. Pretty much below Ocala. Think about that. No settlements at all. Pretty much below Ocala. No trails, no villages, no streets, no nothing. Thick, dense wilderness and swamps. So everything of importance was up north between Pensacola and St. Augustine, down to about Ocala. So with so many Anglo-Americans pouring in and moving south, they needed space. Well, new treaties were signed with the Seminoles and much of their land was taken. Feeling oppressed, the Seminoles and the great Indian warrior Osceola rose up in December of 1835 and ambushed and massacred Major Francis Dade and his men. Dade, let's see, Dade, as in what county? Miami-Dade, is named after Major Francis Dade. Actually used to be called Dade County until they changed the name about 2 decades ago to Miami-Dade. It's named for Major Francis Dade.
This is a special hat. This is a duplicate of the hat that Major Francis Dade wore on that day. I had this hat made. And you can see, what does it have on the top? And who wore feathers? Important people. Especially the commander of an entire company of soldiers. Actually, Major Francis Dade was in charge of 2 companies of soldiers. And they were attacked by the Seminoles near Bushnell, Florida. Where's Bushnell? Sumter County, right. A lot of you, a significant plurality of you, passed Bushnell on the way up here on 75. When you go home, between Ocala and, the point where you approach the Tampa Bay area, Bushnell is right there. And there's a big sign that says the location where Major Francis Dade and his men were killed.
Of the 108 men in those 2 columns, only 3 survived and escaped to tell the story. So here's what happened in December of 1835. The United States had sent from Washington an Indian negotiator, and back then they were called agents. So an agent was sent to help negotiate the plan. His name was Wiley Thompson, and he'd been to other states before coming to Florida. But they sent Wiley Thompson down here specifically to negotiate terms with Chief Micanopy. Now, those of you familiar with Alachua County will recognize the city of Micanopy, just off 75, named after that chief, and also there was Chief Alligator. At one time, Lake City was called Alligator, Florida. Well, Wiley and Micanopy with Alligator negotiated the Seminole deportation to Oklahoma. They had taken their land. They were sending the Seminoles to Oklahoma. This was the infamous Trail of Tears that I'm sure you've heard about. A massive forced exodus of 5 different tribes who lived in the southeast. And they were to be removed and become the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma. They were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Creek. Today, there are 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma. Well, this was December of 1835, and this massive exodus coordinated throughout the southeast, involving those 5 tribes, was planned to begin on January 1st, 1836. Well, here we are in December of 1835, and so the United States was kind of in a hurry to get this new treaty done because they're on a schedule, and their mission was to make sure that all those tribes were banished from the southeast, especially the Seminoles in Florida, the area where the United States wanted to expand. Well, they met for several weeks at Payne's Landing, which is just outside present-day Ocala. At the time, Ocala really wasn't a city, but they had a very nice fort, a big fort there named Fort King. And this tribe of Seminoles decided early on that they weren't going to Oklahoma. They were not going to leave their land. They kind of dug in their heels. So Wiley Thompson was kind of in a fix. Collectively, they decided that the Seminoles were not going to go peacefully. And some of the Seminoles went later, but a lot of them never did go. We have tribes that grew up in that century in Oklahoma and in Florida. There are Seminole tribes in Oklahoma and Florida. The Florida Seminoles were not going.
Well, Thompson realized the probable resistance, and the garrison at Fort King requested reinforcements from another fort, Fort Brooke, which later became Tampa. They wanted to strengthen their position at Fort King, so they called them up and they said, "Hey, can you please send some guys up here to Fort King because I think we're going to have some trouble." Major Francis Longhorn Dade, age 43, was in command of the relief column on the 100-mile march from Tampa to Ocala. It's almost exactly 100 miles. A long way to walk and ride. From Tampa to Ocala. Well, the Seminole plan called for Osceola to assassinate Wiley Thompson at Fort King, which he did with ease and with great pleasure. Meanwhile, 180 Seminole Braves with a bad attitude headed south to Bushnell to wait for Major Dade and his relief column. They actually stalked and ambushed the very surprised U.S. forces who weren't expecting anything like it. And somehow, the Seminoles were equipped with brand new Spanish rifles. How do you suppose that happened? Well, the Spaniards were still hanging around, and anything they could do to cause trouble was a good idea, and those Spanish muskets were far superior to anything that the Americans had, which were just muskets. So the attack began at 8 a.m. on December 28, 1835, an ambush of Dade's column. And when the signal was given, the initial volley from the Seminoles killed or wounded half of Dade's command.
Major Francis Dade at the front of the column, along with Captain Upton Fraser right behind him, riding on horseback at the head of the column, were the first to be killed. They took them out right away. The Seminoles pressed the attack for the next 6 hours, and it was pure slaughter. And when it was over, 105 U.S. soldiers were dead and laid rotting in the afternoon sun. Micanopy and his Seminoles lost only 3 braves. Florida fact number 7. So there began the Second Seminole War, also called the Great Seminole War, the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. The Great Seminole War was the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. Much longer than anything they had going on out west, later with the Apaches and Comanches. 7 years of guerrilla warfare here in Florida, 1835 to 1842. And remember, it was real wilderness, so it was tough to have a battle. So word of updates and the massacre spread quickly throughout the United States. The infamous Osceola, the mastermind of the whole thing, now had a reputation and was feared and hunted by the Americans, especially the American Army. The United States rallied to put the full force, the full strength of their military to work in Florida. So the Seminoles resisted for 7 years, a massive effort to drive them from their home. And the Seminoles didn't lose to the United States as much as they did just retreat further and further south. And that's why the Seminoles ended up in the Everglades and are still there today. And I've got news for you, and this is rather ironic. You'll want to write this down. Seminole Indian chief Osceola was neither a Seminole nor a chief. That's Florida fact number 8. Seminole Indian chief Osceola was neither a Seminole nor a chief. He was half British and half Creek. His father was British, his mother was Creek, and he was a leader of ruthless daring, very smart, but he was never a chief. Micanopy would never have let him become a chief. A tremendous warrior, never a chief. He was also very handsome, as you can see. You can see he doesn't look 100% Seminole because he's not. He's a handsome guy, though, and he died in U.S. prison after being captured under truce. And for his effort, he's been martyred and became even more famous after his death. And that's why we have Seminole County in Central Florida, also Osceola County, just south of Orlando. We have 2 Seminole high schools, one in Seminole County and the other one in Pinellas. And there are several other places named for Osceola and the Seminole legacy. And while I'm talking about counties, who's the only person that 2 Florida counties are named after? 2 Florida counties named after the same guy. Anybody know? Well, the answer is Hernando de Soto. We have Hernando County, just north of Tampa, and we have DeSoto County, which is pretty much south of Tampa, south of Hillsborough County. Florida finally won statehood in 1845, and our first U.S. senators were David Levy Yulee and James D. Westcott of Tallahassee. Now, if you know Jacksonville, just north of Jacksonville is Nassau County, and the county seat there is Fernandina Beach. And if you know Fernandina Beach, then you also know Yulee. Yulee is right next to Fernandina Beach, and it's named after our first senator, David Levy Yulee of Cedar Key, and James D. Westcott of Tallahassee is our second senator, for whom the administration at Florida State University is named. And David Levy Yulee was actually from Levy County, and he was from Cedar Key, but he became most famous for the railroad that he built to take his cedar to make pencils shipped from Cedar Key up to Fernandina Beach, passing through present-day Yulee, which is named for David Levy Yulee. Well, Florida never looked back. Every year since, our population has grown to the point where we are now ranked third among states in population. And during the last few years, we've even passed New York to reach third place in population. Our state's population is now a little over 22 million people, and it's still growing quickly. 1,000 people a day, every day, are moving to Florida. And only Texas and California have more people than we do. In fact, Texas and California will continue to have more people than we do for many years to come. Decades to come, probably, because Texas and California are growing just as fast right now as is Florida. And we have nearly 90 million visitors per year, and that number also grows every year. So stay tuned. We'll be back shortly with the next season and the next episode of the Florida History Show. We'll talk about the Civil War, Florida's railroad men, and get all the way up to the 20th century and its first governor, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Stay tuned. We'll be back.